is a bill for an act to provide limitations on the use of unmanned aircraft for surveillance and to provide for a legislative management study. Mr. Speaker, your Judiciary Committee recommends amendments which were passed on the previous sixth order. When so amended and engrossed, recommends do pass and engrossed House Bill 1373 by a vote of 8 yeas, 5 nays, 1 absent, and 0 not voting. Mr. Speaker.
Representative Toman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker and members of the Assembly, House Bill 1373 regarding unmanned aircraft for surveillance requires law enforcement to obtain a surveillance warrant and also provides exemptions for exigent circumstances such as natural disasters and does not require the warrant for training and education. It also provides in section 4 for prohibits use of surveillance for definitions for prohibited uses. It also has, in the last section, it does not apply to the federal. Let me get down to that last section. Section 8 does not apply to the Federal Aviation Modernization and Reform Act, which would exempt UND's drone program, and it would not apply to them. It also exempts uses of Border Patrol. Your committee recommends do pass by a vote of 8 to 5, and we respectfully request your concurrence. Thank you.
Is there any discussion? Representative Delmore.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Speaker and members of the Assembly, House Bill 1373 is a bill well before its time. Although many of the concerns expressed in the bill are valid, the bill needs to study the provisions of privacy before specific recommendations are made. Passing this bill does not give us sufficient information to see what the road to drone privacy should really look like. I'm concerned about the bill's potential impact on UND's program of unmanned aircraft systems. UND is a national leader and has developed training that is of interest to both the UAS industry and to the United States Air Force. This bill could cause national perception of UND's and North Dakota's role in the UAS to suffer. UND is currently one of the lead universities in a consortium that is vying for a designation by the FAA as a National Center for Excellence of UAS Research. It is involved in the Governor's Airspace Integration Team that is preparing a proposal to the FAA to designate North Dakota as one of 6 national test sites for unmanned aircraft systems. They're already aware of the privacy issue, and they are addressing these concerns. North Dakota could suffer significant negative economic impact after investing considerable time, effort, and financial resources in preparing their proposal as an FAA UAS national test site. 30-plus entities are involved in this issue. Further study of these issues during the interim would allow the FAA UAS national test site designation to proceed without potential concerns about UND's ability to participate in the program. It could signal to the rest of the country that North Dakota is not supportive of the unmanned industry and provide little additional protection for our citizens. I would ask that more work be done with the privacy advocates and industry alike to develop thoughtful, effective legislation that can be considered in the next legislative session. Drones are new technology. Many of the things this bill presents for drones are already allowed for private planes. I would urge a red vote on House Bill 1373. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Cruin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would the bill carrier stand for a question?
Representative Toman, would you yield for a question?
Mr. Speaker, I would.
You may continue, Representative Cruin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In Section 4, you indicated, does this section prohibit private security companies and the general public from using this as surveillance?
Representative Kroon, that's my understanding.
You may continue.
Okay, so then if this is the ability to not utilize security companies in private sector, if they do, what would the penalty be?
In Section 5, it's a civil remedy.
Mr. Speaker, can I continue?
You may continue, Representative Croon.
Then we would have to take that to court at that particular time, and it'd be a civil penalty. And what laws do we follow under that to get to that point, because it doesn't address them?
Representative Kroon, I'd defer that question to my chairman.
Representative Koppelman, would you care to answer that question?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and Representative Kroon. Section 4 under prohibited surveillance deals specifically with, as it says, use of force, domestic use in private surveillance, and so on, but it has to do with a state agency authorizing that kind of use. The bill is silent, as far as I can tell, about any private use. So if you have, and I'm sorry he's not here today to demonstrate, but if you have a private model aircraft or something that you want to use, nothing in this bill prohibits that. You'd be subject to the other limitations in law. You might remember a few years ago, for example, we passed a bill that had to do with limiting the ability of surveillance even in your own home. A lot of people have these security systems where you'll mount cameras around your house. That's legal, but it becomes illegal when you point them through your neighbor's window. And those similar laws would apply in these cases.
Mr. Speaker, can I continue?
You may continue.
So we can use these for private use, or private people can use them for surveillance of other people if it doesn't infringe.
You may continue. Answer, Representative.
Well, Mr. Speaker, my reading of the bill simply prohibits a state agency from authorizing the use under these in Section 4, which is the section that was referred to, in certain circumstances. It does not, however, change anything else in law that would be legal if you have a camera, a video camera, a security system on your home or business. Anything you could do with those instruments, you could also do with this kind of instrument. That would be true of law enforcement as well. If they want to protect the police station and fly a drone over it 24/7, I guess they could do that. That'd be a little expensive, but there are easier and cheaper ways to do it. What they can't do is spy on you without a search warrant under the bill.
Mr. Speaker, can I continue?
You may continue.
In Section 3, then, the Border Patrol has a 25-mile radius, and there are exceptions for that. Who makes the determinations on those exceptions?
Representative Koppelman, would you care to answer that?
Mr. Speaker and Representative Kroon, let me get to that section. Under Section 3, Item 1, it says that the patrol has to do with the patrol of national borders, and it says that the use of unmanned aircraft to patrol within a 25-mile radius of a national border for purposes of policing that border to prevent or deter illegal entry of any person is not prohibited by the Act. I don't know what kind of determination would be needed there. I think it's pretty clear, 25 miles.
Mr. Speaker.
You may continue.
Representative Koppelman, would you please continue if I could ask another question?
Mr. Speaker, I will try.
Thank you. If you look at number 2, the use of unmanned aircraft by a law enforcement agency is permitted when the extenuating circumstances exist. That's the one I'm mainly looking at. That's not defined very regularly. And then in also with catastrophes and those kinds of issues, who determines those? I mean, what we're doing is what I'm getting at, Mr. Speaker, is that we are convoluting some of the system to get at what these actual planes can do. And I think we're plugging the system, to be honest with you, to get at it. We're limiting the ability for what that technology can be used for.
You may continue.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'd be happy to, Representative Kroon, if you have more, I'd answer that question. I'd like to continue answering some of the others that have been raised. If you have others, if you want to state those, I'll try to envelop them all into one response.
Mr. Speaker, Representative Koppelman, also, you know, in Section 7, it indicates that we have to keep certification of the information all the time, and then that is held at our state records of office, and is that of every flight that takes place by a law enforcement agency's unmanned aircraft?
Mr. Speaker, I guess we're still doing it one by one. Representative Cruin, Mr. Speaker, Representative Cruin, and members of the Assembly, the purpose of this bill and the specifics that you're talking about had to do with essentially law enforcement. As you mentioned, Border Patrol is a big piece of that. And we worked with law enforcement on the bill. I should give the Assembly a little bit of background. I was going to do that in a general statement, but it's probably necessary to touch on these specifics as well. And essentially, when this bill first came to us, there were several concerns raised. One of the main concerns was from law enforcement. And we have, actually the sponsor of the bill has addressed a lot of those concerns with an amendment he proposed to the committee. The other main objection came from the University of North Dakota because of their program. And their concerns, I don't think they addressed any of the specifics that are being raised now in the bill. They were just concerned that the tone of the bill could be read to somehow jeopardize the program they have and they're embarking upon. The committee was concerned about both of those issues, and so we did two things. We worked with law enforcement extensively to go through the bill, to look at the various specifics. The two you've mentioned, you know, the issue of law enforcement's ability to pursue someone near the border if there's danger to life or limb, that's not much different than the powers that law enforcement have now. And using any other kinds of technology or any other kinds of resources they might have. The same is true, I think, with what you're looking at here in terms of how long the records are held. I'm looking for this section where it actually addresses it, but I know that we amended the bill dealing with that specifically to ensure that these records are not held for any length of time. They're held for a period of time and then they're destroyed. I'd have to comb the bill to find exactly where that is and what the time period is. The important thing, however, is that the committee has addressed those concerns, and if you look at the section toward the end of the bill, the statement was made earlier that this could be a concern for UND and so on. We were very cognizant of that, and so if you look at Section 8, where it says application to federal law on page 4, this act may not be construed to limit, constrain, or adversely impact testing and operations of a state test range under the FAA Modernization and Reform Act of 2012. That is the specific legislation that has to do with UND's program. We've written it right into the law that nothing in this can in any way impinge upon that. So if the federal government reads the statute, they'll know that's true. The general public should know it's true based upon what we're saying here today. With respect to studies, we do have a study in the bill because we agree that this is new technology. The committee believes that it's something we should continue to look at. But I think this is an example of a bill sponsor, a legislative committee coming together and the concerns being addressed, the concerns that were raised were cared for, and law enforcement now is not opposed to this bill. It basically tracks the normal routine of law enforcement. And so I think the committee has done good work, and I would hope you'd support the bill.
Mr. Speaker, could I continue?
You may continue.
With all of those comments taken into consideration, and I do appreciate the committee working as hard as it's done, has done its work, but I still believe that some of these questions are a little bit ambiguous, the answers I got that aren't direct. I do feel that we are overreacting to some of the technology that is already available and the way we use it. It's kind of strange that we have millions and millions of dollars being swept away out of our credit cards, and yet nobody's brought a bill up to defeat that. But all of a sudden we have a little new technology and we direct it only at the law enforcement agencies. I would feel much more comfortable if there was a more direct approach to the people that would misuse this rather than use it. I would ask that we defeat this bill at this particular time because I don't believe we've considered all the ramifications and the benefits of the technology that's being developed today. Thank you.
Representative Becker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can somebody help a representative here, please? Mr. Speaker, members of the Assembly, this bill addresses a very, very simple question. Should law enforcement be required to have a search warrant to do surveillance on a private citizen? There's nothing more to it than that, really. And that question is underscored, the importance of that question is underscored when I had conversations with some of law enforcement. And some law enforcement thought that it was appropriate for drones to be able to obtain information by surveillance in order to use that information to get a search warrant. I think that's the cart before the horse. So what we want to do is simply say to law enforcement, you need a search warrant if you're going to do private citizen surveillance. This bill is so completely non-restrictive, it would be hard to find a way to make it less restrictive, but still have the need for a search warrant. Other states, Montana and Virginia, have passed in at least one of their houses each bills that don't allow drones by law enforcement at all. This is not a knee-jerk, technophobic reaction. This is a new technology, indeed. It's advancing rapidly, and it's going to be deployed rapidly. And if you don't think so, then you should take a look at the seminars that are being held for law enforcement, for the sheriffs of the various counties in our state, and it'll be deployed rapidly. Now, the question about funds and economic and this and that, I can tell you that this bill bends over backwards to cozy up with UND and FAA to say to any individuals that are looking at it, we're not against drones, we're not against you, we believe that they're important and useful, we simply want a search warrant. The question that Representative Kroon posed, which sort of pits this bill against law enforcement, is not the correct approach to take. Why law enforcement, not private citizens? Because law enforcement is the only one that can take the surveillance, take the data, and use it to take a citizen to a court of law, handcuffs, et cetera, et cetera. So it's not against law enforcement. It just says we want to cover this gray area and make it not gray. We just want to say black and white. If you want to do surveillance, go ahead, but you need a search warrant. And the exigent circumstances in there, which I think you indicated are not clear, are the same types of circumstances they use every day. The exigent circumstances for reasonable belief that there could be imminent bodily harm or injury takes care of so many circumstances. This is not anti-law enforcement. This is a simple way to say, let's get that search warrant before we use drones on our citizens. Thank you.
Representative Kiefert. Representative Mock.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Will the bill carrier yield to a question?
Representative Toman, would you yield to a question?
Mr. Speaker, I would.
You may continue, Representative Mock.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And Representative Toman, what was the discussion related to the bill? And this is, I think we can all respect the intent of the bill. And I actually have visited with the bill sponsor in a few occasions about bringing this idea forward, and I applaud him for those efforts. But my question is in 8 sections of law, and clearly an issue that's still very new and information still coming forward, why did the committee keep the language in the bill to enact law and study the implications of this at the same time? Why was it not either a bill or a study?
Representative Mock, we put the study on there because this is a new technology, and we worked the bill with the amendments to fit into current surveillance law. So we thought if we studied that, we would get back if we need to be collecting more data or requirements for the warrants or how these drones can be used.
Mr. Speaker, will the bill carrier yield to one more question?
Representative Tomac, would you yield to another question?
Mr. Speaker, I would.
You may continue.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and that's great. I'm concerned that because there's still so much information that needs to be found, why we're not focusing all of our efforts on studying the issue before enacting legislation. Would you be able to speak on behalf of the committee on that rationale?
Representative Mock, I can try. This House Bill 1373 deals solely with surveillance, using drones for surveillance, and then the exemptions. So we put the study on there to find out if we need to add into law any other restrictions or requirements for the use of drones, and private citizen use was brought up by Representative Kroon, and so that would probably be involved in that study as well.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
You may continue. Are you done? Representative Nathy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would the bill carry you to a question?
Representative Toman, would you yield to a question?
Mr. Speaker, I will.
You may continue,
Thank you,
Representative
Mr.
Nathy.
Speaker. Representative Tolman, was there any discussion during the committee, was there any examples of violations or of drones looking in houses or any of those sorts of things? Was there any discussion about that at all?
Representative Nathan, yes, we had some discussion on that.
But any examples, any complaints?
No complaints to date.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Representative Tolman. I hope we can defeat this bill, and I'll tell you why. I think this bill is anti-law enforcement. I trust my law enforcement. When I have a policeman walking through my neighborhood, I don't think he's looking through my window. He's trying to protect me. You have a drone up there. This bill says we have to get a search warrant in order to look in my backyard. What's the difference? Again, I just don't agree with this. I think it's no different. I think this is what we always say. This is a solution looking for a problem. And I think this, quite honestly, appeals to the black helicopter crowd. Let's study this some more and look at it next session.
Representative Ammerman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Representative Kay Koppelman, stand for a question, please.
Representative Koppelman, would you stand for a question?
Mr. Speaker, I will.
You may continue, Representative Ammerman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and Representative Koppelman. Let's say the Game and Fish was able to use drones maybe next year or whatever to take surveys of the animals so they know how many licenses to issue and so on. In the process of taking surveys of these animals, they ran across a crime in the maybe even a killing or poaching. In a court of law, because there's no search warrant, would they be able to use that film to prosecute the criminals?
Mr. Speaker and Representative Ammerman, that's an excellent question. And I want to point out, especially with the issue of law enforcement being raised, when this bill first came to us, law enforcement was opposed to it. And that's why the committee held on to the bill. That's why the committee visited with law enforcement about it. Law enforcement suggested some amendments, and we adopted those amendments. And with the amendments, law enforcement is no longer opposed to this bill. They think it works just fine. The point that you raised, Representative Ammerman, is exactly one of the points that we've cared for in the bill, which is that the bill simply says if law enforcement wants to do surveillance of you, they would need to get a search warrant. That's true right now, regardless what other kind of surveillance they might be using. If it's a video camera parked in a van in front of your house, they need a search warrant to do that. If it's tapping your phone line, they need a search warrant to do that. If it's putting a camera in your backyard permanently or for an extended period of time, they would need a search warrant to do that. They don't need a search warrant to patrol the streets. Likewise, in this bill, they don't need a search warrant to patrol with a drone. If they're doing another kind of activity that is normal activity, you mentioned Game and Fish. I don't know if they're using these for animal census or not. I know that they use airplanes and other things. If they ever use drones, nothing in this bill would change anything like that. And if law enforcement is on a warranted flight, in other words, they're up there because they have a search warrant to do something specific, and they happen to see other criminal activity that has nothing to do with that warrant, then they can use that information. They just can't go on a fishing expedition, which I think is what the sponsor was after. So the committee did good work on this bill. Law enforcement was involved with and suggested the amendments. The committee adopted the amendments, and we think they work.
Representative Casper.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, members of the Assembly. If this bill is a problem in search of, or a solution in search of a problem, maybe we ought to look at the Constitution as a problem, because the North Dakota Constitution, Article 1, Section 8, and the United States Constitution under the Fourth Amendment are identical in verbiage, and they read as follows. the right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated, and no warrants shall issue but upon probable cause supported by oath or affirmation, and particularly describing the place to be searched and the persons or things to be seized. Constitutional rights are important to me, Mr. Speaker, and I think they're important to most of the people here in the body. If we allow a surveillance of a citizen or a business, as the bill says, without a search warrant, we're violating the Constitution. It's plain and simple. If we do not pay attention to the rights of our citizens and look to the Constitution for when law enforcement wishes to enforce or look at whether or not there is cause and say you must get a warrant. It's all it says, get a warrant if you want to look for criminal possibilities. Our constitutional rights guarantee that that's what they must do. This bill does the same thing. I hope that we'll support the bill, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Belter.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would certainly hope that we would pass this bill. We always want to err on the side of the citizen. Our home is our castle, and we don't allow any authorities to break into our home because they think they should. They need a warrant to do it. With the technology that is available now, you can have little drones that are almost like a hummingbird, and they can go and look in every window of your home, and we as a legislative branch are going to say that's okay to do without a warrant? I don't think so. When there's probable cause, it's very easy to get a warrant. And so that I would certainly hope that we'd pass this bill. The people of North Dakota deserve the rights that our Constitution has provided. And this could certainly be an infringement of that.
Representative Kaiser.
Mr. Speaker, would the bill carrier or the chairman yield to a question?
Representative Toman, would you yield to a question?
Mr. Speaker, I will.
You may continue, Representative Kaiser.
Mr. Speaker, Representative Tolman, this has been an interesting discussion. It caused me to ask my seatmate the question, can the authorities now have a stakeout in the alley and look in my backyard or on the street and look in my windows?
Representative Kaiser, not if you have a wood fence or the drapes pulled.
That doesn't work, Mr. Speaker. You don't have a fence. So you maybe have a chain link fence. Can they do that legally? Do they need a warrant?
I believe they do, yes. My chairman can correct me if I'm wrong.
Representative Cruin, second time.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's been mentioned several times that law enforcement is in concert with this particular bill. I will read you just a small portion of our sheriff in Grand Forks County. And this proposed legislation flirts with being in violation of the Equal Protection Clause found within the 14th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. Specifically, 1373 would supposedly protect citizens from perceived search and seizure and privacy intrusions perpetrated via use of unmanned aircraft systems. However, no parallel legislation exists to regulate surveillance from a manned aircraft. And in almost every instance, manned aircraft are more capable and robust surveillance platforms than UAS. They carry much heavier sensor payloads capable of much longer mission durations, and essentially the legislation makes it unlawful for the Grand Forks County Sheriff's Department to monitor the county fair for traffic control and crowd control issues, but does not limit a deputy from circling a private residence in the Cessna 172 taking video and photos of the location. This is just a severe disconnect of reality. That's the law enforcement stand from Grand Forks County. And I could read a lot more. Thank you.
Representative Nathy, second time.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Real quickly, I just again want to say there is no example of law enforcement violating anybody's rights with the drones. None whatsoever. And let's not kid ourselves. Law enforcement doesn't like this bill. They just like it a little less after what happened in committee. Thank you.
Is there any other discussion? Representative Kay Koppelman.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, members of the Assembly. This has been a very interesting discussion. I think many of us have hopefully all of us have a great respect for law enforcement and the role that they play. I've certainly worked with them in cooperation on countless pieces of legislation over the time I've been here. When this bill first came to our committee, we had questions. We had concerns, many of the same ones that have been voiced on the floor today. We addressed those concerns. We waited to deal with this bill until we had amendments that we thought would either make it acceptable and plausible, or we would have given you a do not pass recommendation. What occurred is that I went as the chairman of the committee to the North Dakota Peace Officers Association, and I said, let's talk about this bill. Let's talk about the concerns you have. Is there a way that this bill could be acceptable to you? Is there a way that you could feel it's okay and even support it? Or is it just bad public policy? And they said, no, we understand what's going on here. We understand what they're trying to do, but we don't like some of the specifics in the bill. The result of that are the amendments before you from the North Dakota Peace Officers Association in consultation with their members, who are our local law enforcement officials. Now, some of the statements that have been made on the floor are made in good faith because early on, you're right, law enforcement did have some concerns about this issue. I don't know for sure, but I don't believe those statements have come based upon the amended version of the bill, the amendments that the committee recommended, that this body adopted, that came from the Peace Officers Association, the very law enforcement folks we're talking about. So let's take a 30,000-foot view of this issue, since we're talking about drones. First of all, the question is, we've got technology involved, and the statement's been made in this debate that, well, gee, we should wait with technology. We shouldn't do anything about technology until we really understand it and know where it's going. I think if you take that approach to technology, we'll never do anything, because technology changes rapidly. So the question is there something we should do now to address the situation we see now? We're not going to be back here for 2 years. And the question is, as has been said very eloquently, I think, by some of the members of the Assembly, we have an obligation constitutionally to protect our citizens. Do we have an obligation to respect law enforcement as well as servants of the public? Absolutely. Do we have an obligation to listen to them and take their concerns into consideration? Absolutely. Have we on the Judiciary Committee done that? Absolutely. So what the bill does essentially right now is it protects our citizens from unwarranted search and seizure. That is constitutional. That's something law enforcement likes as a theory. They don't dislike that. They think they ought to have a warrant to be able to do things that they shouldn't do without one. Number two, it protects UND. That was a legitimate concern that was raised. Number three, it protects our border. That's another concern that was raised. Number four, it doesn't unnecessarily tie law enforcement's hands anymore. Perhaps the original bill, you could argue, did, because it allows them the flexibility they need to do their job. The bill before you has been well vetted, has been well amended, and I would hope you'd uphold the committee's recommendation and pass the bill.
Representative Casper, second time.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'll be brief. Since the 14th Amendment was cited, let me read the 14th Amendment to see if you can find where the 14th Amendment applies to the citizens' protection in the bill. No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privilege of immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protections of the law. I think that's pretty clear, Mr. Speaker. Thank you.
Representative Clemene.
Well, Mr. Speaker, members of the Assembly, the North Dakota Supreme Court has ruled on this subject in 1981 on searches. And they held in a 1981 case of States v. Plants that if a person has a reasonable expectation of privacy, then a search warrant is necessary. However, if something is in plain view, then a search warrant is not necessary. So it's going to turn on the facts of each case as to whether something is in plain view or not, or whether a person has a reasonable expectation of privacy. So that's the standard for issuance of whether a warrant is necessary or not. And all this bill does is says, under these circumstances where a drone is used for purposes of surveillance, and it's probably going to be in an area where someone has a reasonable expectation of privacy, then a constitutional requirement steps in and says you must get a warrant on, show that on probable cause. And that's, I think that's reasonable.
Representative Becker, second time.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I just wanted to address the black helicopter comment. And I just wonder if Representative Nathy feels that the GOP is part of that crowd. Because part of the national GOP platform is we support pending legislation to prevent unwarranted or unreasonable governmental intrusion through the use of aerial surveillance, ... Thank you.
Is there any other discussion? Seeing none, the House has before it for final consideration House Bill 1373. The clerk will open the key and you may record your vote. Has every member voted? Does any member wish to change their vote? The key will be closed. The clerk will take the record. Final vote shows 60 yea, 31 nay, 3 absent, not voting. House Bill 1373 is declared passed.